for the One-Stop Pilot Program Act of 2021, H.R. 4209, the DHS Illicit Crossing Border Tunnel Defense Act, H.R. 4363, the DHS Contract Reporting Act of 2021, H.R. 4426, the Homeland Security for Children Act, H.R. 4611, the DHS Software Supply Chain Risk Management Act of 2021, H.R. 4682, the Unmanned Aerial Security Act, and H.R. 4691, the K through 12 Cyber Security Act. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any time. The chair wishes to announce that to the extent practicable, it is my intention to take any recorded votes as they are requested and not roll votes. Members are reminded that the committee will operate according to the guidelines laid out by the chairman and ranking member in our February 3rd colloquy regarding remote procedures. The chair further reminds members participating remotely to have their cameras on during recorded votes. The chair also wishes to direct members to the most recent guidance from the Office of Attending Physician. It states that masks are now required for all members and staff in all hearing rooms unless a member is under recognition. The chair will enforce this guidance. With that, I now recognize myself for an opening statement. This is also the committee's first hybrid markup since the COVID health emergency. I appreciate participation by members here with us today in person and here virtually. Most of the measures to be considered today have broad bipartisan support. 3 bills are targeted at enhancing supply chain security. The committee's vice chair, Mr. Torres, has a bill to improve how DHS manages supply chain risk associated with the software it buys. In light of recent cyber attacks, the approach taken in the DHS Software Supply Chain Risk Management Act is on point. I'm also pleased that legislation Mr. Correa has worked on for years to enhance supply chain security at DHS uniforms is on the agenda. Enactment of H.R. 2915 will provide frontline personnel with higher quality Made in America uniforms at a time when we all have a renewed appreciation for the need for a strong U.S. industrial base. The last of the supply chain bills comes from my colleague from Mississippi, Mr. Guest. It seeks to prevent DHS from purchasing drones from China and other adversaries. In addition to these measures, we are considering Mr. Gottheimer's bill, the Darren Drake Act, to reduce the risk of terrorist attacks using rental vehicles. It is named in honor of his constituent who died in such an attack, and I know this bill is close to his heart. Mr. Langevin, a true leader on cybersecurity, has his bipartisan measure to improve cybersecurity in K through 12 schools. On the theme of protecting children, we also have the Homeland Security for Children's Act introduced by Mr. Payne to ensure that all DHS components address the needs of children in their policies and practices. Additionally, we are moving legislation to support DHS's efforts to present illicit cross-border tunnels and improve transparency regarding procurement opportunities. Last but not least is a pair of TSA-related bills. First, there's a bill introduced by the ranking member, Mr. Katko, for seeking to improve security at airports with direct flights to the United States. I know this has been a long-standing interest for the ranking member. I'm pleased to have worked with him to enhance baseline security protections to positions this new initiative calls for. The other TSA bill on the agenda is a long-standing priority for me and many of you on this committee, H.R. 903, the Rights for TSA Workforce Act. Since the establishment of TSA, its workforce has been treated as second class. Unlike most other federal workers, the hardworking men and women of TSA do not receive the pay and workplace protections under Title V. The negative effects on TSA are not in dispute. TSA suffers from low morale, high attrition, and injustice. Frontline TSOs are not only underpaid, but lack the ability to build a career path. Further, federal workers at TSA lack the collective bargaining rights and whistleblower protections that their colleagues elsewhere in government have. My bill fixes this once and for all by simply applying Title V to the TSA workforce. Last Congress, the House twice passed this measure. I'm pleased that 12 Republican members are co-sponsors of this legislation this time around, including 2 who serve on this committee. Thank you, Mr. Vandrew and Mr. Gabarino, for your support. Unfortunately, last Congress, we had an administration that did not want to work with us. This time around, we're fortunate to have President Biden in the White House. I've been heartened by the level of engagement by the Biden administration on this issue, including Secretary Mayorkas' June directive to start moving toward Title V protections and benefits to the TSA workforce. Ahead of today's markup, I understand that a number of amendments have been filed by my Republican colleagues. I appreciate their engagement on this legislation, but while these amendments on the surface may appear to move the needle, they fall far short of reform needed at TSA. I urge members to take to heart what AFGE, which represents the screening workforce, encouraged us to do in a letter I received today. The committee is urged to stay strong and reject amendments that, quote, weakens intent to achieve fair play, a fair opportunity, and put an end to this failed, toxic system. Without objection, I'd like to put in the record a letter from Ashley dated July 28, 2021. Without objection, so ordered. After 2 decades of TSA experiment, where I got authority to get creative in how it designed its personnel system, a temporary pay increase will not suffice as proposed in one amendment. Neither will protecting, but not all workers, and other amendments does. TSA workers should be treated the same as their colleagues everywhere in government, period. I know there's concern about the cost and whether appropriations will come through. As an authorizer, I will commit to all of you and the TSA workforce that this legislation, as this legislation advances, I will actively engage with the Biden administration and appropriators to secure full funding for Title V adoption. And I trust this bill 219 bipartisan co-sponsors will help advocate for funding with me. Again, thank you to our members for joining us today. And though we have some areas of disagreement, I appreciate the bipartisan approach that the ranking member has taken to get us to this day. I now recognize Mr. Katko for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to see you today, and I know how busy you've been lately, so I appreciate the you being there in person today, so thank you very much for that. This morning, the committee will consider a number of bipartisan pieces of legislation that will demonstrably enhance America's Homeland Security while holding the administration accountable. I'm pleased to see so many Republican bills on the roster, and I want to commend the chairman for his ongoing commitment to bipartisanship through this Congress. I believe that the chairman and myself are not just talking the talk or walking the walk, but when it comes to bipartisanship, and that's something that's somewhat rare this Congress. Today, the committee will be marking up a number of Republican-led bills brought forward by dedicated members that address Homeland Security issues on a number of critical fronts. These include H.R. 4209, the Illicit Cross-Border Tunnel Defense Act, sponsored by the ranking member of the Intelligence and Counterterrorism Subcommittee, Mr. Pfluger. This bill will ensure the administration is responding to one of the many security threats along our southwest border by authorizing our resources to detect and mitigate tunnels routinely utilized by drug cartels to conduct illicit trafficking operations. Ranking Member Pfluger has been on the front lines working to address the crisis, and I applaud his leadership on this issue. Additionally, we will consider Vice Member Guest's Unmanned Aerial Security Act, HR 4682, which will force Homeland Security to take action to counter the growing threat to economic and homeland security posed by the Chinese Communist Party by prohibiting the department's use of Chinese-made drones. Vice Ranking Member Guest's bill will also require Homeland Security to conduct a timely threat assessment these drones pose to security. Yet another example of the supply chain issue that is plaguing the United States at this time. The Vice Ranking Member's legislation wisely recognizes and takes action to address a malign influence of the Chinese Communist Party's efforts to undermine the American way of life. Also under consideration today is Representative Harshbarger's Homeland Security Contract Reporting Act of 2021, or HR 4363, that increases transparency in Homeland Security contracting. Ms. Harshbarger's bill requires Homeland Security to establish a website anyone can visit to learn about what Homeland Security buys and where it spends its taxpayers' dollars. This is ultimate in transparency, and it will give us a great glimpse into how Homeland Security spends taxpayer dollars, and it's simply good government. It will also help to Homeland Security achieve greater trust from the American people. This important legislation underpins Representative Harshbarger's commitment to eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse within the Department of Homeland Security. Furthermore, the committee will consider legislation I introduced, the One-Stop Pilot Program Act of 2021, HR 4094, which will help secure international inbound aviation in a more effective, efficient manner. This legislation builds upon previous legislation I've passed to raise a global baseline for aviation security and give TSA leverage to ensure enhanced security at overseas airports with direct flights to the United States. For this bill, the chairman is offering an amendment of which I am very supportive, and I thank him for working with me in support of One-Stop Security. I also want to thank my Democratic colleagues for bringing together several important bipartisan bills for this markup and for working with Republican members to address concerns and agree on amendments. In consideration of 903, the main bill we're talking about today, was sponsored by Chairman Thompson. We don't all agree on that bill, but it's not the end of the world. While I would argue most issues under this committee's jurisdiction are largely bipartisan in nature, there will be times in which we will respectively disagree, and that is okay. And we can just disagree without being disagreeable. But over the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about where I'm at with this bill. And I want one thing to be clear. It's the first time a ranking member or a member of the Republican Party that's ahead of the Homeland Security ever advocated for Title V. So I am coming halfway, trying to meet you all on this bill, and I'll explain that. I'm very displeased with the manner in which the transportation security officers have been treated with respect to their pay. Indeed, administrator after administrator has made false promises to me in that regard. Administrator Prokowski, though, has succeeded in providing the workforce with modest pay increases and retention bonuses. Overall, however, TSA and the Office of Management Budget have failed miserably for years to adequately fund better salaries for the frontline workforce, the people who are there every day keeping bombs off our planes and exposed to public, especially during the pandemic. And let's not forget, this is the same workforce who worked for free for many, many days during the government shutdown a few years ago, and they did their job admirably. They have been pawns left flapping in the wind, as legislators and executive branch officials alike have failed to work together to get them solutions. Frankly, I'm sick and tired of hearing the same talking points from TSA spanning both Democratic and Republican administrations. And if the Biden administration is truly a pro-workforce as it claims to be, funding for better pay should be reflected in the administration's budget request. Today, though, I'm offering two amendments that I think would provide a better solution to the challenges facing the TSA workforce than the underlying bill text. And I look forward to speaking more specifically to when they are considered. But in a nutshell, I am concerned about the frontline workforce. We've always had bills in the past focused on the frontline workforce, getting them Title V spending, and you've always met resistance from Republicans in that manner. Now, we are saying we agree with you. We've come to the table. We want to give Title V to the workforce. At least I do. and the frontline workforce. The problem is this bill goes far more into that and gives people that are making 150,000 a year or 200,000 a year in the bloated bureaucracy at TSA, the same Title V coverage, which will make it so expensive that we'll end up not being able to pay for it at all, and it'll get knocked out in the Senate. I'm telling you right now, if you limit it to the workforce, I will support Title V, and I'll be the first ranking member or chairman ever to do that. So with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to the discussions going forward.
Thank you, Ranking Member Katko. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. By agreement between the chair and ranking member, the committee, by unanimous consent, shall use an amendment roster today.
Mr. Chairman, reserving the right to object, and I will not object. Would the chair please explain our agreement regarding the amendment roster? I yield to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman and all committee members for agreeing to the use of an amendment roster. We've agreed that the bills be open to amendment at any point and that we will take up amendments in that order. The chair will now allow members to offer amendments listed on the roster out of order to the extent practicable and in a manner not prohibited by House or committee rules. Amendments not listed on the roster may be considered at the conclusion of consideration of the roster. Also, by unanimous consent, the chair will recognize members with bills or amendments included in a list of agreed-upon measures for statements at the conclusion of the markup.
I thank the chair for this explanation and would withdraw my reservation.
I now call up H.R. 903. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 903, to enhance the security operations of the Transportation Security Administration and stability of the transportation security workforce by applying the personnel system under Title V, United States Code, to employees of the Transportation Security Administration who provide screening of all passengers and property and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for purposes of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 903, offered by Mr. Thompson.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered base text for purposes of amendment. I will now recognize myself to explain the amendment. I'm proud to be offering today an amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 903, the Rights of the TSA Workforce Act of 2021. Today represents the next step in the pursuit of basic workers' rights and benefits for TSA employees. Over the years, with the unwavering support of the American Federation of Government Employees and other stakeholders, we've made significant progress toward achieving this goal. Last Congress, the House twice passed this legislation. Over the past year and a half, TSA employees served bravely on the front lines of Homeland Security during the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet, transportation security officers remain among the lowest paid federal workers. They do not receive regular salary raises like most other federal employees, and few of these frontline security workers have seen more than a few $1,000 raises even after years of service. Unsurprisingly, TSA continues to struggle with low morale and high attrition, consistently ranking near the bottom of the annual federal government Best Places to Work survey. This year, TSA once again ranked dead last, 407th out of 407 agency subcomponents on pay satisfaction. Low morale and high attrition have an adverse impact on the agency, crippling TSA's ability to develop a mature workforce. According to the DSA Inspector General, over a two-year span in 2016 and 2017, 1 in 3 transportation security officers quit. We cannot continue to ask these brave men and women to protect us from terrorist attack, yet not provide them with better pay and the basic protection most federal employees receive. My legislation would fix that by placing TSA under Title V, the time-tested system that most of the federal workforce include. Importantly, unlike some alternative approaches that will be discussed today, the bill provides a permanent fix by ensuring TSA employees will receive regular salary increases far into the future and providing workers with a meaningful avenue to bargain over their treatment. The amendment, in the nature of a substitute I'm offering today, is the result of close collaboration with the Department of Homeland Security, AFGE, and other stakeholders over the past 7 months. I, along with many of my colleagues, have been encouraged by the Biden administration's desire to strengthen worker rights. Secretary Mayorkas' June directive to start moving TSA to providing collective bargaining rights, third-party appeal rights, and better pay is very encouraging. Ahead of today's markup, we worked with DHS to modify the bill so it builds upon the administration's desire to strengthen worker organizing and collective bargaining. In recognition of the ongoing work being done at the Secretary's direction, my amendment expedites the timelines to provide Title V, collective bargaining, and appeal rights within 90 days of enactment. I also adjust the timeline on fully transitioning the workforce from 180 days to the end of 2022 in response to TSA's request for additional time to secure appropriations and plan. I understand that some of my colleagues across the aisle are concerned about what happens if TSA does not receive new funds for the transition in Title V. Rest assured that after advocating for this transition for over a decade, I have no intentions of fumbling the ball on the 1-yard line. I'm committed to working with appropriators and the Biden administration to secure full funding to implement this bill, and I know the bill's 219 co-sponsors will be happy to advocate for funding right along with me. To date, over 8,000 TSA employees or contractors have tested positive for COVID-19, and at least 19 have unfortunately died after contracting the virus, with 2 deaths in the past week alone. We owe it to these brave civil servants to get it right. I'm proud of the collective bargaining efforts of this committee, the Biden administration, and stakeholders to develop the amendment we are considering today to provide the TSA workforce these long overdue rights and benefits. I thank my colleagues for their support on this bill. With that, I yield back. Is there any further discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Ranking member is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to talk generally about this for a moment because it's a weird situation. I agree with almost everything you said. What you're talking about with respect to the frontline workers, I couldn't be more in agreement with. I've been in Congress. This is my 7th year now, and we've heard nothing but BS from TSA about they're going to take care of the frontline workers, and I share your concerns about them. And everything you said about the frontline workers, I agree with, including saying it's time for us to give them Title V. The problem is this bill goes much farther than that and gives Title V to everybody in the bloated bureaucracy at headquarters. If you limited it to Title V for the frontline workers, which you always have done in the past, I don't believe there's ever been a bill introduced in the past that went beyond the Title V for the frontline workers. This bill now goes well beyond that, and that's where the rub is for me. So I'll talk more about my amendments when I come up, but I just wanted to let you know, I think we're in full agreement on helping the frontline workers. And if we limit it to that, as I suggest in my amendment, and I speak more about in a minute, I think we could get there. And I would note that you've passed this bill before out of the House and it's died in the Senate. So as laudable as your goals are to get the funding, it's going to have the same problems it had before unless there's a real bipartisan signal. And if the ranking member signs on to it, I think that is a pretty strong signal that you haven't had in the past. So I would just urge you to reconsider, but I understand we've had these discussions before today, and I just want to make sure my position's clear. We appreciate everything that the frontline workers have done. I'm more than impressed with their dedication, to duty, and it's not lost on me how many people have lost their lives during COVID because of being exposed to COVID, but while doing their job and keeping us safe. But this bill goes far beyond, and if we have a hard enough time getting funding for the frontline workers with your previous bills, how are we going to get people to go and give a lot more money to cover everyone else that this bill would cover if it went to the Senate? And with that, I yield back and I look forward to speaking more on my amendments in a moment.
Chairman,
Chair recognizes the young lady from Texas.
I thank the chairman very much, and this is a long-suffering bill. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your excellent leadership, and thank you to Chairwoman Bonnie Watson-Coleman as well for her leadership. Having served as the chair of the Transportation Security Committee and Infrastructure named at that time, this is long overdue. I don't have to recount for members, even those who are newly traveling through the airport system as repeatedly as we have done over the years, the frontline responsibility of TSOs. But you have to have had to been here in the immediacy of 9/11 when the Bush administration at that time cobbled together the Homeland Security Department, and it was cobbled together. Previously, the security, which most people probably could not even remember at airports, since parents, friends, and everyone would be at the gate welcoming their loved one, was almost non-existent. But we had to stand up a professional workforce, and we did. We did it, however, with much bumps in the road. And one of the plagues of TSOs is the issue of retention, professionalism. Midway, we established the training in the school in Georgia to try to build on professionalism, but that didn't work. Retention did not increase. And that is because the benefits did not in any way equal the responsibilities that are given to these officers. In the sense of this legislation, we have the opportunity to correct a wrong that has now lasted for now 20 years, as we will commemorate 9/11's 20th year this year. How tragic it is that these individuals are not able to address the questions of unequal personnel management, intimidation, harassment, discrimination, stories of despair, not having enough money to make ends meet. Many of these TSOs are former military. Many of them are dedicated to their service. Needless to say, as the ranking member has indicated, they suffered mightily during COVID-19. In fact, they were some of the ones that lost their lives and were infected before we were able to handle how to address their frontline work. We know that one TSO was killed in the line of duty in California. We heard from his widow and his family in the line of duty. How much more do we have to hear before we know that this legislation is long overdue? I think many of us, including the United States Senate, Mr. Chairman, have forgotten the way we've done business here. And that is why we didn't go anywhere in the United States Senate. I hope this time they will. In years past, the House would make its will, the Senate would make its will, and there would be a conference committee, and we'd have a bill. And then the president, whoever it might be, would sign it. Frankly, I have a lot of friends in the United States Senate. I'm sure many of us do. I'm glad the majority now is a Democratic majority. I trust their integrity and their faith in the American system, Constitution, and principles of democracy. But the Senate needs to work its will, take this bill, or work its will, and we need to go to conference. We cannot tolerate any longer allowing TSOs to suffer as they have suffered. They are professionals if we give them a professional infrastructure. They are professionals by their commitment and duty if we give them a commitment and duty in the infrastructure. This legislation that Mr. Thompson has offered, glad again this year, gives that infrastructure. You cannot have a workforce that does not have guideposts, the ability to recruit, the ability to retain. You cannot suffer a workforce that is without a statutory structure. And so this legislation, in my opinion, repeals the TSA's administrator's authority to maintain a separate and unequal personnel system. Which is extremely important. It requires TSA to follow the labor management, employee relations statutes, and again, it puts TSA, squarely on the footing of a professional security agency as part of Homeland Security. Mr. Chairman, I support your amendment in the nature of a substitute and support H.R. 903. Ask my colleagues to support it. And finally, would ask that the Senate work its will and this bill become law now. I yield back.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to say how important I believe the bill is, and despite some differences here.
Hold on just a minute. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I seen for too many years, too many people working too hard up front on the front line who haven't been treated respectfully, haven't been treated with the the necessary respect that they deserve for the job that they do, the danger they take, the hours they work, and quite frankly, what they have to put up with and what they have to go through. And I think it's about time that that come to an end. They shouldn't certainly be the last of all the workers to be understood, respected, or for that matter, paid a normal amount of money. So I applaud the sponsors of this bill, and I know there are a good number of them, and yourself, Chairman Bonnie, of course, Leader Katko and others. I think it's really important. I didn't want to necessarily repeat everything everybody else says, except when people put their lives on the line, and in essence they do, and when people are willing to be the ones who are up front, and they are, we have to recognize that as a nation. We have to recognize that as a governing body. We have to recognize that as the Congress. So I think it's important that we move forward with this. Thank you.
Thank you, gentleman. Yields back.
Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes gentleman
Mr. Chairman,
from South
I guess
Carolina for 5 minutes.
point of inquiry, what is the starting pay for a TSA, TSO employee? And secondly, is there a national shortage I hear, read the bill about the low morale and whatnot, but is there a national shortage that exists now between the?
Well, even though it's not a parliamentary inquiry, they're the lowest paid employees in the federal system. That's documented. We have some 46,000 TSOs working at over 400 airports in the country.
Okay, if you look up the pay scale, the starting pay is $49,650.
Yeah.
If you look at the average police officer in this country, who is far less than the average salary for a police officer, is $34,600.
Well, if you look at the average salary for a TSO person, it's $29,500.
Okay, well, I guess that may be first year, but the average for.
Well, gentlemen, I'm trying to, if you need some background information, we'll be happy to provide it for you, but your line of questioning is inconsistent with the discussion.
What about the shortage? Is there a national shortage?
They're looking for 2,000 people right now. That's been publicly reported.
Okay, well, I guess my issues with the bill, as Mr. Katko explained, it's overreaching in a lot of areas, and the $1.7 billion that they say it cost is more in line with $2 billion. But I think there's some real concerns, as Mr. Katko says, it didn't pass the Senate, and by not having bipartisan support, it's going to have a tough time again. But that's just some of my concerns. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair will now recognize members with amendments appearing on the roster. The clerk will designate the first amendment offered by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko, on the roster.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 903 offered by Mr. Katko.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The chair recognizes the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Katko, for 5 minutes.
Well, first of all, I appreciate you saying distinguished. I'm not sure that's worthy of me, but thank you. But I want to make sure which amendment we're talking about, sir. Is it about simply giving the frontline personnel salaries a raise, or is it about the amendment to Title V, your Title V bill?
Clerk, will you repeat the amendment for Mr. Katko?
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 903 offered by Mr. Katko.
Continue to read.
Strike page 1, line 1, and all that follows and insert the following. Section 1, short title. This act may be cited as the Support for the TSA Frontline Workforce Act of...
Thank you. I'm sorry. I understand which one it is, and I apologize. I'm not present. So thank you very much for that accommodation.
Gentlemen, recognized.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Here is this amendment would significantly improve morale for TSA by granting transportation security officers, which is obviously the subject of our discussion today, federal air marshals, a 5% pay increase in year one, 5%, followed by 3% pay increases the following 4 years. So you're talking about 17% pay increase over a 5-year period, at least that. Probably more than that when it builds on each other. Additionally, this amendment would give the frontline workers a $3,000 COVID exposure bonus in acknowledgement of the frontline's service and dedication throughout the pandemic. Lastly, this amendment authorizes TSA to utilize a passenger security fee to pay TSOs during a government shutdown. This amendment puts congressional priority where it should be and where we've all discussed today, on the front lines of the workforce and with our federal law enforcement officers, rather than with bureaucrats at TSA headquarters who are already getting paid a heck of a lot more. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Are there any members? Is there any further discussion? I'd like to speak in opposition to the ranking member's proposal. I appreciate the ranking member's support for improving pay for the frontline workforce, and especially his proposal to provide hazardous pay bonuses for those working during COVID-19 pandemic. I'm pleased there appears to be broad support for that provision, as my colleague from New Jersey, Ms. Watson-Coleman, has an amendment that will be considered shortly that includes that too. The critical difference here, of course, is that unlike Ms. Watson-Coleman's proposal or my underlying bill, this amendment would unfortunately do little to empower TSOs in the long term with predictable salary increases and critical workplace protections. Instead, it proposes a short-term infusion of cash that will not shore up collective bargaining rights or give TSOs access to a third-party appeal process or set the agency on a sustainable path to combating its long-standing and costly retention problems. This stands in stark contrast to what the bill we are considering today would accomplish. Finally, moving TSA employees to a personnel system that would put them on a stable trajectory to earn higher pay and the kinds of protection that most all other federal employees have. I believe all of us on this committee agree with the sentiment expressed in this amendment that Congress has not done our part in to reflect the appreciation we have for the hard work of TSOs by providing them with the pay they deserve. But it is exactly for this reason that we want to fix the system for good with H.R. 903. Instead of giving the TSA workforce a short-term cash infusion that will do little for their long-term professional prospects within the agency. If we want to support TSA's employees, we should listen to them. We should give them a meaningful way to have their voice heard and advocate for their needs through collective bargaining. My bill is about more than just improving pay. It's about providing TSA workers with the basic rights and protections and setting the agency up for the long-term success. Let me be clear. Most critical reform in this bill, in my estimation, is that it provides TSA employees with fair collective bargaining rights afforded to other federal employees. This amendment would do away with the reform entitling. While it purports to be pro-workforce amendment, behind a window dressing is truly an anti-labor amendment. For that reason, I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting to set aside this amendment and instead support H.R. 903 as offered today in support of TSA's workforce.
Will the gentleman yield? You had time on the clock, they just cut it off, okay.
The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Texas.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the real question here is, what kind of workforce do we want? You've indicated 2,000 are needed at this time. I've known TSA when more numbers were needed. I go through airports, and every airport I go to or through, I talk to TSOs or their supervisors. And you always ask the question, do you have enough staffing? And the response is that under the circumstances, without a professional scheme, if you will, for the work that is done, for the interactions with the public, for encounters that we in Congress may not hear about, altercations, other discussions that are not pretty, that TSOs have to address. We know that there has been a record outbreak of misbehavior on airplanes. There's misbehavior in airports that are not necessarily recorded as much as that is recorded on airplanes. TSOs address those questions. They deal with all kinds of issues in the traveling public, and their responsibility is to treat each of those passengers with dignity and respect. That's what we would expect. Security does not have to come with disrespect. And so to develop that base of employees, professional workforce that deals with national security, aviation security, airport security, then you need to have a force that is not dominated by the administrators, with all respect to those administrators' different whims. And that is what H.R. 903 does, and it is not just a salary question. And I know the ranking member has always looked to be bipartisan, and we appreciate that, and agreeable as opposed to disagreeable. But the reason why I think 903 is ready at this time is because we as a country are growing, and we are growing with different, when I say growing steadily. Our travel is coming back, aviation travel, but we are always going to face incidences or episodes in our history that require that aviation security be paramount. To make aviation security paramount, I think 903's time is now to make this a legislation that can be utilized to build a professional workforce in the TSOs and TSA. I yield back.
The chairman yield. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I listening to
California is
the.
recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Listening to this debate, I was not going to comment, but a lot of the comments brought me back to 9/11. It's been 20 years to that day when the bad guys actually scored on us, and it was a big breach of our national security. Thousands of American lives lost, changed the way we do business, the way we conduct ourselves on a day-to-day basis forever. It's been 20 years. And you know, as a passenger, every time I go through airport security, if I can think of the days before I served on this committee to today, as a passenger, you run through security and you think about the hassle, the pain of having to put your stuff on that conveyor belt. You know, what are these people doing? Why is this such a pain? Why are they slowing me down? Then after chairing like you, ma'am, chairing that TSA subcommittee, when you look at the job these folks have to do, looking at those x-ray machines, and every year that we try to modernize, bring in new software into those machines so they can better detect what's going through those machines. And I'll stop there because the rest is classified. But to think of the job they do, to think of the training they need, and as my colleagues talked about salaries, colloquy on salaries. Would we ever question the salaries of an FBI agent? Would we ever question the salaries of a CIA operative? Would we ever question the salaries of a police officer? Yet, TSA does suffer morale. Problem of morale is turnover. Do they pay them enough? Question is, do they stick around for the job long enough to move it to the next level? And based on the committee hearings we've had here over the last few years, they don't. This is an entrance position. You come in, you get into a federal job, and you move to the next level right away. Yet you need a professional workforce to be our frontliners at the airport. We cannot afford another 9/11 breach. We all know that the prized jewels of a terrorist would be to bring down another airline, to bring down a plane full of American passengers. That is big. And this is our front line of defense, these TSA workers. And so now, after spending a few years on this committee, now after going to tour these airports, looking at the back area of operations, I began to understand their job, keeping us safe, making sure that nothing gets through, making sure 100% is the score through thousands of airports in this country and outside this country. So why do we want to professionalize these folks? Why do we want to make them a union member? Because you want to make sure that they want the job. And you, Mr. Chairman, talked about thousands of job openings right now. They're not easy to fill because every time you fill a job opening, they turn over within a year. So you take 3 to 4 months to train one of these TSA workers. 6 months later, year and a half later, they're gone. Is that the kind of FBI agents you want? Is that the kind of professional frontline workers you want to be defending our airways? Absolutely not. We, as a legislature, have to do everything in our power to protect American citizens, especially in our airports. And that's why, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for bringing this issue up. Our ranking member is absolutely right. He's worked with you on this issue. This issue is going to have challenges moving through the legislature, but it doesn't mean we don't try. And it doesn't mean we don't put our back into it, because the national security of our country is dependent on having professional TSA workers at the front lines. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. There being no further debate, the question on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The nays have it.
Mr. Chairman, I would request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. The clerk we're doing a hybrid hearing, as you know. Those members who are on their cameras, please turn them on. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Jackson Lee? No. Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Langevin?
No.
Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Payne? Mr. Correa? Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Slotkin?
No.
Ms. Slotkin votes no. Mr. Cleaver?
No.
Mr. Cleaver votes no. Mr. Green?
Green votes nay, no.
Mr. Green votes no. Ms. Clark?
Ms. Clark votes no.
Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Swalwell?
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no. Ms. Titus?
Titus votes no.
Ms. Titus votes no. Ms. Watson-Coleman?
No.
Ms. Watson-Coleman votes no. Ms. Rice?
Rice votes no.
Ms. Rice votes no. Mrs. Demings? Demings votes no. Barragan?
Ms. Barragan votes no.
Barragan votes no. Mr. Gottheimer?
No.
Mr. Gottheimer votes no. Mrs. Luria?
No.
Mrs. Luria votes no. Mr. Malinowski?
Malinowski, no.
Mr. Malinowski votes no. Mr. Torres?
Oh, it says aye.
Mr. Katko?
Mr. Katko goes aye.
Mr. Katko votes aye. Mr. McCall?
McCall votes aye.
Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Guest?
Aye.
Mr. Guest votes aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Van Drew?
Mr. Van Drew votes no.
Mr. Van Drew votes no. Mr. Norman? Mr. Norman votes aye. Mrs. Miller Meeks?
Miller Meeks, aye.
Mrs. Miller Meeks votes aye. Mrs. Harshbarger?
Harshbarger votes aye.
Harshbarger votes aye. Mr. Clyde? Aye. Mr. Clyde votes aye. Mr. Jimenez?
Mr. Jimenez votes aye.
Mr. Jimenez votes aye. Mr. LaTurner? Mr. Meyer?
Aye.
Mr. Meyer votes aye. Mrs. Kamick?
Aye.
Mrs. Kamick votes aye. Mr. Pfluger?
Aye.
Mr. Pfluger votes aye. Mr. Garbarino?
No.
Mr. Garbarino votes no. Mr. Payne? Mr. Higgins? Mr. Bishop? Mr. LaTurner?
Because you're right, people.
How am I recorded?
The chairman is not recorded.
Chairman votes no.
Chairman votes no.
The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 19 yeas and 11 noes. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. On that vote, there were 11 yeas and 19 noes.
Thank you very much. On this vote, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Give me that backwards.
It is now in order to consider the amendments on the roster.
Mr. Chairman, I
offered
have
by
an
the
amendment.
Woman from New Jersey, Ms. Watson-Coleman. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 903, offered by Mrs. Watson-Coleman.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from New Jersey, Ms. Watson-Coleman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to first thank you for your tireless work on behalf of the TSA workforce and for bringing this legislation forward today. The bill before us is the result of years of work and represents the input of the Department of Homeland Security, as well as stakeholders across the transportation security sector. This is not simply a short-term boost to the wallets of workers, though it does provide that, but a long-term investment in an empowered, protected, and appropriately rewarded TSA workforce. In addition to a few technical changes, my amendment would ensure a smoother transition to the new general schedule pay grades for TSA employees in a manner that recognizes each employee's time and service. Additionally, in recognition of the hazardous duty and significant sacrifices made by frontline workers during this difficult period last year and a half, my amendment will provide a $3,000 bonus to employees whose duties have placed them in contact with the public during the COVID-19 pandemic. That language is based on a proposal from my friend, ranking member Katko, and I thank him for raising this idea. Finally, we want the new Title V protections for the TSA workforce to be a floor, not a ceiling. My amendment clarifies that the TSA administrator is able to provide benefits that exceed those in Title V, as long as those benefits are crafted in collaboration with the workforce and their unions to fully meet their needs. I again thank the chairman for his work on this issue, in this Congress and for many years, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and this bill. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Is there any further discussion? There being no further debate, the question on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from New Jersey, Ms. Watson Coleman. Those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
Opinion of the
No.
chair. The ayes have it. Gentleman from Georgia. A recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Jackson Lee. Mr. Langevin. Mr. Payne. Mr. Correa. Did you hear something? Ms. Slotkin?
Aye.
Ms. Slotkin votes aye. Mr. Cleaver?
Aye.
Mr. Cleaver votes aye. Mr. Green? Ms. Clark?
Aye.
Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Swalwell? Ms. Titus?
Titus votes aye.
Ms. Titus votes aye. Mrs. Watson Coleman?
Yes.
Ms. Watson Coleman votes yes. Ms. Rice?
Rice votes yes.
Ms. Rice votes yea. Mrs. Deming?
Sorry. This is no.
Mrs. Deming votes aye. Ms. Barragan?
Paragon votes aye.
Ms. Barragan votes aye. Mr. Gottheimer?
Aye.
Mr. Gottheimer votes aye. Mrs. Luria?
Aye.
Mrs. Luria votes aye. Mr. Malinowski? Mr. Torres?
Aye.
Mr. Malinowski votes aye.
I vote aye.
Mr. Torres votes aye. Mr. Katko?
Aye.
Mr. Katko votes aye. Mr. McCall?
No.
Mr. McCall votes no. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Guest?
No.
Mr. Guest votes no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Van Drew?
Mr. Van Drew votes aye.
Mr. Van Drew votes aye. Mr. Norman? No. Mr. Norman votes no. Mrs. Miller Meeks?
Miller Meeks, no.
Ms. Miller Meeks votes no. Mrs. Harshbarger?
Hirschberger, no.
Mrs. Harshbarger votes no. Mr. Clyde? No. Mr. Clyde votes no. Mr. Jimenez?
Mr. Yanez votes aye.
Mr. Jimenez votes aye. Mr. LaTurner?
No.
Mr. LaTurner votes no. Mr. Meyer? Mrs. Campbell?
Mr. Meyer votes no.
Sorry, Mr. Meyer votes no. Mrs. Kamick? Mrs. Kamick votes no. Mr. Pfluger?
No.
Mr. Pfluger votes no. Mr. Garbarino? Mr. Garbarino votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Aye. Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Langevin? Mr. Payne? Mr. Correa? Mr. Correa votes aye. Mr. Green?
Green votes aye.
Mr. Green votes aye. Mr. Swalwell?
Aye.
Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Higgins?
Okay, can I get off this?
Mr. Bishop?
How am I recorded?
The chairman is not recorded.
Chair votes aye.
Chairman votes aye.
Clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 21 ayes, 10 noes.
21 ayes, 10 noes. Thank you. On that vote, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider the second amendment on the roster offered by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 903 offered by Mr. Katko.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, the ranking member, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And while I support the underlying bill's intent to improve conditions for screeners and FAMs by moving them into Title V status, I cannot support moving the entire agency at TSA into Title V. That is something that has never been proposed before by this committee by anyone. In my years of oversight experience with TSA, I found the agency's headquarters to be bloated and oftentimes wasteful and plagued by bureaucratic inertia. Unlike the frontline employees, DC-based bureaucrats under Title V have traditionally proven to be ineffective, inefficient, and shielded from discipline and accountability. I believe existing issues with headquarters to be related to TSA's common practice of aligning policies for headquarters staff with Title V as much as possible, which has led to frustrating inefficiencies. I would like to work with my colleagues on this committee to develop legislation that would more effectively hold headquarters personnel accountable, but I fear that if the agency enters Title V in its entirety, which again, I'll stress is the first time this has ever been proposed, we will lose authority and limit options to hold TSA management accountable. My amendment would limit the move to Title V to only the frontline workforce like screeners and FAMs. I believe this would send a strong message of support to the frontline workforce while serving as a critical shot across the bow to TSA headquarters and allow this committee to retain the ability to hold bureaucrats accountable. And Mr. Chairman, I'll note that all the discussion today is completely in alignment with what I'm saying, except perhaps what some of the things you said. Sheila Jackson Lee spoke twice, my colleague and friend. Her entire discussion was about protecting the frontline TSO workers. Jeff Van Drew spoke passionately about protecting frontline TSO workers. Mr. Correa, my friend and colleague, spoke passionately about protecting frontline workers. None of them said anything about dealing with the bureaucrats at headquarters. I think everyone wants to help the frontline workers. And that is exactly what this amendment does. It's not a gimmick by me. And I'll reiterate again, this is the first time a ranking member or a Republican chair has ever supported Title V funding for frontline workers. I think would send a very powerful message to the Senate that there is bipartisan agreement for this at the leadership level. And I would urge my colleagues on the Democratic side, you're my friends, you're my colleagues. I don't often drag out these hearings like this, but I believe strongly that these workers need to get paid, and and I agree with all of you about what they've been through and what they deserve, and they don't deserve what they're getting now. But what we've done, we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, making it even more difficult than in years past, where you haven't been successful in getting Title V funding for the frontline workers. You're making it that much more difficult by layering on hundreds of millions of dollars more to pay people at the front line at the headquarters who no one is arguing is underpaid. If anything, they're overpaid. And so the whole genesis of my argument today was that I was sick and tired of the bureaucrats at TSA giving me assurances that they were going to properly pay these workers so they didn't need Title V. I now am done with that argument. And that's why I'm supporting this amendment. Give the workers Title V funding. Send a signal to the Senate that we, at the leadership level, as well as people in the Republican Party, want to give Title V funding to the frontline workers. And I think it's far past due, and it'll give it a better chance of passing. If you don't, like I said, I feel we're going to throw a baby out with the bathwater. So I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I yield back to balance my time. And thank you.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes the young lady from Florida.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you and the ranking member for your work to improve overall airport security. I was assigned as a police captain to our international airport for 5 years, including during 9/11. Of course, security is a priority, but I believe so is fundamental fairness. I rise to speak against this amendment. The purpose of the underlying bill is to fix a long-standing injustice, remember that word. While almost all federal workers fall under Title V, TSA's workforce does not. The common sense solution is to apply Title V to TSO's entire workforce, period. That's exactly what the underlying bill has done. Unfortunately, this amendment is playing politics with these workers' basic rights. The ranking member's previous amendment called Title V an antiquated, bureaucratic, and inflexible personnel system. Now this amendment claims to prioritize the treatment of the frontline workforce by placing only them under Title V. So which is it? If the Title V system is so bad, why would you want to prioritize placing frontline workers under it above all others? This amendment seeks to exempt a substantial portion of TSA's personnel from Title V, creating a bifurcated system that would be extremely difficult to manage and lead to significant inequities. Critically, the exemption of senior management from the checks and balances in Title V would be a recipe for waste and abuse. We all understand how TSA's special personnel authorities have resulted in unpaid TSOs. Less known is that the same authorities have been used to line the pockets of senior TSA executives. In one instance, a senior manager received an annual bonus of $90,000, a bonus over 3 times the size of a starting salary of a TSO. A bonus that large would be unlawful under Title V, which caps retention bonuses at 25% of an employee's basic pay. But under the current system, which this amendment seeks to retain for management, this kind of waste would continue. Simply put, TSA management officials should not have the ability to develop the personnel system that applies only to themselves with very little regulation, as this amendment would allow. The problem with this amendment runs deeper, however. Title V is not just about pay, as the chairman has so eloquently pointed out. It is also about workplace protections. Why do we fear that? According to statements of a former top deputy administrator of TSA, the lack of due process protections for TSA has bred a culture of retribution and arbitrary personnel practices, leading to misbehavior and a reluctance to report security vulnerabilities. TSA senior management has a history of retaliating against whistleblowers, including through directed reassignments that would ship managers and their families across the country without recourse if senior management didn't like something they said. The good government practices under Title V have been developed and refined over decades. They must be applied to the entire TSA workforce to ensure equitable treatment and protect against waste, fraud, and abuse. I would venture to say with high confidence that no member
of Congress in this room would want the job of the TSA because it would be too great a burden to bear the responsibility. Workplace protections are important. Pay is protection. And we should never be afraid of fundamental fairness. I urge my colleagues to reject this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
There being no further
Chairman?
debate.
Mr. Chairman,
Gentleman from New York.
yeah, I'm really not trying to nitpick here, but I do need to correct the record. What I stated previously about Title V was that unlike frontline employees, unlike DC-based bureaucrats under Title V have traditionally proven to be ineffective, inefficient, and shielded from discipline. So I said Title V is definitely appropriate for frontline workers, definitely not for the bureaucrats in DC in the front offices. And if you're worried about the actions and the conduct of employees in the front offices, Title V will shield them much more so than they are right now from discipline. And I yield back, including mistreatment of workers below them. So I yield back the balance of my time.
There being no further debate, the question on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed?
Aye.
No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I would request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Jackson Lee? Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Langevin?
No.
Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Payne? Mr. Correa? No. Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Slotkin?
No.
Ms. Slotkin votes no. Mr. Cleaver? Mr. Green? Ms. Clark?
I vote no.
Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Swalwell? Ms. Titus?
Titus votes no.
Ms. Titus votes no. Mrs. Watson-Coleman?
No.
Mrs. Watson-Coleman votes no. Ms. Rice?
Rice votes no.
Ms. Rice votes no. Mrs. Demings? Mrs. Demings votes no. Ms. Barragan?
Barragan votes no.
Ms. Barragan votes no. Mr. Gottheimer?
No.
Mr. Gottheimer votes no. Mrs. Luria?
No.
Mrs. Luria votes no. Mr. Malinowski?
No.
Mr. Malinowski votes no. Mr. Torres?
No.
Mr. Torres votes no. Mr. Katko?
Aye.
Mr. Katko votes aye. Mr. McCall?
That they have a hot mic, or can the staff mute people when someone's going to get themselves in trouble? So can we just have the staff mute them, please?
Well, we can only mute them if we know it, and I understand, but we can't do it at that exact moment, but we'll do our best. Clerk will continue.
Mr. Higgins? Mr. Guest?
Aye.
Mr. Guest votes aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Van Drew?
Mr. Van Drew votes no.
Mr. Van Drew votes no. Mr. Norman? Mr. Norman votes aye. Mrs. Miller Meeks?
Miller Meeks, aye.
Mrs. Miller Meeks votes aye. Mrs. Harshbarger?
Harshbarger votes no.
Mrs. Harshbarger votes no. Mr. Clyde?
Yes.
Mr. Clyde votes yes. Mr. Jimenez?
Mr. Jimenez votes yes.
Mr. Jimenez votes yes. Mr. LaTurner?
Aye.
Mr. LaTurner votes aye. Mr. Meyer?
Aye.
Mr. Meyer votes aye. Mrs. Kamick? Mrs. Kamick votes aye. Mr. Pfluger?
Aye.
Mr. Pfluger votes aye. Mr. Garbarino? Mr. Garbarino votes no. Mr. Payne? Mr. Cleaver?
Aye.
Mr. Payne votes aye. Mr. Cleaver?
Cleaver votes aye.
Mr. Cleaver votes aye. Mr. Green?
No. Green votes no.
Mr. Green votes no. Mr. Swalwell?
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. McCall? Mr. Higgins? Mr. Bishop?
Is there any other members wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote?
Yes, okay. Yes.
Gentleman from Missouri?
I changed my vote to aye.
Mr. Cleaver votes aye.
No, I'm asking, did I vote aye?
Gentleman from Missouri? Clerk will report the gentleman from Missouri vote.
Mr. Cleaver's recorded as an aye.
No, yes, I would like to be recorded as a no.
Mr. Cleaver
I was
votes.
asking if I voted aye, yes.
Gentleman.
Thank you.
Gentleman from
Mr.
South
Chairman.
Carolina. Gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman, how is he recorded?
Mr. Norman is recorded as an aye. Mr. Norman votes no.
Is there any other member wishing to change his or her vote?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Payne, how am I registered?
How is Mr. Payne recorded?
Mr. Payne is recorded as an aye.
I would like to change my vote to a no.
Mr. Payne votes no.
How am I recorded?
The chairman is not recorded.
Chair votes no. Clerk
Chairman
will
votes
report
no.
the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 10 yeas, 23 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. It is now in order to consider the amendment on the roster offered by the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Kamak. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 903, offered by Mr. Guest.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Kamak, for 5 minutes.
Point of clarification, Mr. Chairman, I believe you said Mr. Guest?
No, I didn't.
I believe the
Kamak.
I believe the clerk.
The clerk said Mr.
Clerk,
Guest.
we just want to be clear, Mr. Chairman, whether we're debating my amendment or Ms. Kamak's amendment.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, you said Florida, and the clerk stated it was Mr. Guest. I just want to be clear which amendment we're on. No, you didn't.
The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 903, offered by Ms. Kamick.
Okay, without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Kamick, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. My amendment is simple. It prioritizes national security at TSA. I have some concerns about the underlying bill, including the bill's expansion of collective bargaining that could put national security at risk by subjecting new procedures or requirements imposed by the administrator of the TSA to collective bargaining. This amendment is quite simple. It would clarify that the administrator of TSA is not limited in his or her ability to swiftly respond to national security and/or public safety threats under this bill. Specifically, the amendment ensures that any procedures or requirements shall not be constrained by collective bargaining. The very nature of airport security requires that TSA remain agile and flexible to new and emerging threats. It's for this very reason that Congress exempted TSA from Title V when it stood up the agency just 2 months after the terrorist attacks on 9/11. It is imperative that the administrator continue to have the authority to swiftly make these changes to ensure public safety in response to national security threats or risks. Now, this amendment would ensure that the administrator does not have to negotiate with union representatives whenever changes would impact the TSA workforce, regardless of the national security implications. It adds language that explicitly preserves the administrator's authority and exempts changes to security screening procedures from collective bargaining. I hope my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will support this clarifying amendment to ensure that national security threats are addressed immediately at TSA and not collective bargaining in the way of that national security. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Are there any members who wish to speak? Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for bringing this bill. It's so important. I just won't restate all the reasons that I agree with those who have said that. I had hoped to offer a perfecting amendment to Ms. Kamick's amendment to just remove some of the confusing language, but I understand that that's been blocked by the minority party, which I find very frustrating after you've worked so hard with the other side to make them part of the process. We've always tried to be bipartisan when it comes to national security, but apparently they are not going to let me offer the amendment. I'd like to just speak on it briefly, though, because I think it would solve the problem that Ms. Kamick is hoping to resolve with her amendment, but do it in a better way. My amendment would remove from her amendment confusing and unnecessary language on collective bargaining and instead refer to language in Title V that already exists and covers these issues that she's described. Section 7106 of Title V states that nothing in Title V, and I quote, shall affect the authority of any management official of any agency to determine the mission and internal security practices of that agency. Additionally, under Title V, the administrator would maintain authority to, and again I quote, take whatever actions may be necessary to carry out the agency mission during emergencies, and that would include the issuance of security directives and emergency amendments. Title V would already ensure TSA management can issue security requirements and respond to emergencies without security directives being subject to any collective bargaining negotiations. In our discussions of this bill, TSA themselves agreed that the language in Title V is sufficient to protect the administrator's security authorities. TSA's sister agency, U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, has 27,000 officers with Title V collective bargaining rights. They don't negotiate security policies with their workforce's representative, and they have no problem directing security policies. The collective bargaining language in this amendment is thus unnecessary and problematic. Saying these security issues shall not be subject to collective bargaining would simply imply that they otherwise would have been without this amendment, and that is just simply not true. It misrepresents the bill, and it could cause confusion about congressional intent of what is excluded from bargaining. So you don't need this amendment. You can just rely on Title V language that already exists. And I regret that I've not been able to offer it as a perfecting amendment because of the other side's just unwillingness to hear it and threats to blow up the hearing and block everything else if I did offer it. So I won't offer it, but I would like those comments in the record because it's absolutely true that this is already covered in Title V and we don't need this amendment. It will only cause confusion. I thank you and I yield back.
Is there any further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Young lady is recognized.
I would like to argue that this amendment is exceptionally clear. In fact, it is a clarifying amendment that brings clarity to this particular issue. There is no need to change the amendment, and I can't understand why all of us, regardless of whether we have an R or a D behind our name, would not double down on national security as a top priority and make sure that the language was crystal clear. We know that agencies tend to thrive in gray spaces and take liberties with interpretations. This amendment simply clarifies that we do not put collective bargaining over national security, keeping the TSA in a very flexible and agile state in order to respond to national security threats.
Is there any further discussion?
Yes, if I may.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Recognized. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe that expanding the collective bargaining rights for TSA employees would definitely result in security policies and procedures being negotiable topics in union bargaining. Under current law, TSA can impose new security requirements such as enhanced passenger screening when intelligence indicates credible national security threats. Under this bill, how new security requirements are implemented could indeed be subject to negotiation with the union. So I think we need to ensure that we have an efficient and effective personnel management system that meets the national security mission of protecting the traveling public. And so therefore, I would encourage all members to support this amendment. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. There being no further debate, the question on the
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman. This is Mr. Jimenez.
Mr. Jimenez.
Yes, I'd like to make comments on this, please.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I fully support this amendment at this time. It is clarifying and very clear that items of national interest and procedures that would protect our traveling public are not subject to collective bargaining. And though there may be language in Title V that says something like this, I believe that for national security sake, we need to make sure that it is absolutely clear that when the administrator feels that certain procedures need to be changed, that those procedures will be implemented and that it will not be the subject of collective bargaining. There are many gray areas in contracts, and we have to make sure that this is crystal clear. This is not one of them. This is not the subject of collective bargaining. And as a former mayor of Miami-Dade County, who dealt with 10 different unions, I can tell you that there is a lot of language that may sound clear or they may look clear, but that the unions will always say, well, no, it doesn't really mean that. And they have plenty of attorneys to say, no, it doesn't really mean that. This clarifies it and it will protect our safety. Thank you.
Chairman, I strike the last word. I just wanted to clarify that we're talking about workers here that during the pandemic showed up to work with no pay to protect us, to keep our airline safe, to keep our country safe. And these are the people whose really loyalty to our country we're questioning. Is that what I'm hearing today, Mr. Chairman?
That is the intent, from what I understand, of the amendment.
With all due respect, Mr. Chairman, no one is questioning the loyalty of our frontline workers.
No, well, explain what you.
Well, if I can, thank you, Mr. Chairman, is we're talking here about collective bargaining somehow being contradictory to our national security when we have workers right now that are not represented by any labor organization who voluntarily showed up to work during the pandemic when we had chaos essentially reigning in this country. And these are the people we're concerned about. We want to make sure that their collective bargaining agreements somehow do not subvert our national security. Is that what I'm hearing?
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, this amendment is simply clarifying language to give very little wiggle room to the administrator should he or she have the need arise to make a change in the event of a national security threat. I think everyone in this room can agree that national security supersedes collective bargaining agreements in the face of a national security threat. And as we know, in the wake of 9/11, that is exactly why there was an issue with Title V. So again, we are not saying that this is contradictory to national security. We're simply prioritizing national security in the event of a threat.
May I, Mr. Chairman? I don't want to get into a colloquy here, but I wasn't a federal legislator during 9/11. I was a member of Congress during COVID, and I saw those TSA workers without representation showing up to work to protect us, and these are the people we don't want to give wiggle room, because to wiggle room to do what? Do the wrong thing when it comes to national security? I think this amendment is totally unnecessary. Just look at the human nature, the way our frontline workers behaved during a very chaotic time in our nation's history.
Mr. Chairman, will the gentleman yield?
Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Florida first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just say, there are tens of thousands of law enforcement agencies that have collective bargaining agreements. As a career law enforcement officer and a chief of police, I have never seen where our safety and security or our national security was threatened in any way or compromised or obstructed by a collective bargaining agreement. So, you know, we can talk about what we think might happen. I'm telling you what has happened. I believe the amendment is totally unnecessary and almost insulting to the administrators of the TSA and the men and women on the ground to say that they need to negotiate in an emergency or national security situation. I do not support this amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to reclaim my time.
I'm sorry, Mr. Correa.
I'd like to reclaim my time.
Gentleman has 57 seconds.
Thank you. National emergency, 911.
Yes.
All of you remember the burning buildings in New York. Those police officers and firefighters were collectively bargained, collectively represented. They didn't stop and ask their representatives, should we run into burning buildings? They did the right thing. They sacrificed their lives for Americans. And here we are asking possibly union represented members, TSA frontline workers, we're going to question whether they're going to do the right thing during a national emergency. I find this unbelievable. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Chair yields back. Gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I would agree with Ms. Kamak that in times of national security interest, that should outweigh collective bargaining. We know that TSA has to be able to address threats very quickly, that threats change at times on almost a daily basis. And for us to be bound by collective bargaining agreements and not be able to put in place the policies and procedures we need to protect the traveling public, I believe that is the intent of Ms. Camack's bill. I agree with her and everyone else in this room. TSA are crucial government employees who work day in and day out, often doing a thankless job to protect the traveling public. And I don't think this is a slight on those individuals. I think this is giving the agency the flexibility that they need, that in times of crisis to be able to act very quickly. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would like to yield the remainder of my time to Ms. Camack.
Young ladies yielded the remaining time.
Thank you, Representative Guest. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to read the amendment. It's in its entirety so that it is fully on the record for all of my colleagues. Nothing in this act shall be construed to limit the administrator's authority to immediately impose new security screening procedures or requirements, or change existing security screening procedures or requirements to address a national security or public safety threat as determined by the administrator. Any such procedures or requirements shall not be subject to collective bargaining. Ms. Titus, in her perfecting amendment, examined and took the body of this amendment and struck the last sentence. So there was continuity and agreement that national security is of the utmost concern. And I think it's uncomfortable right now because people don't want to be on the record on this issue of collective bargaining in the face of a national security threat. So again, I urge my colleagues to put politics to the side, put our national security first, and accept this clarifying amendment.
Would the gentlewoman yield?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Young lady from Florida is
Thank you,
recognized.
Mr. Chair. You said that Ms. Titus's amendment pretty much mirrored yours with the exception of striking the last sentence, I believe is what you said. So there again, back to Ms. Titus's point, then if that's the case, it's already addressed in Title V. What is the purpose for the amendment? I yield back, Mr.
Thank you.
Hammond.
Chair recognizes the young lady from Nevada, Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank Ms. Demings for clarifying that. I would add to her point, she said that thousands of police officers and law enforcement around the country have collective bargaining, and they are not threatening our national security. I would add to that 27,000, as I said before, officers with the U.S. Customs and Border Protection also have these same protections under Title V. Surely the Republicans are not saying to us that they trust the Border Patrol more than they trust TSA after all the criticism we have heard in this committee and elsewhere about the border coming from that side of the aisle. I would also suggest that the sponsor of this amendment, who says that we're afraid to cast a vote, that what this is really about in their thinking or in their strategy or their ideology is they just don't like unions, and whatever they can do to restrict their ability to fight for pay and working conditions and long-term protections, they will do it. And this is an example of just that. And finally, I would say, again, this flies in the face of those across the aisle who are always telling us how much they support law enforcement. Well, saying it and doing it are two different things. You can say it all you want to, but if you don't have respect for the people wearing the uniform and support them in the job that you are asking them to do, to put themselves on the line every day to protect us and to protect national security, then no, you are not pro police officer or pro law enforcement or pro any of these people who make those kind of sacrifices. And so I just take offense at those comments that were made by Ms. Camack.
Mr. Chair.
Young lady, time has expired. Young lady from
Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much. Just to capture a little bit of history, is that I was here during 9/11, and I think my friend Mr. Correa made the point. New York City has had collective bargaining in both their fire and police department for ages. I want to say more decades. And so, in the light of this being the 20th commemorative year of that heinous act of terrorism, cowardice, the one thing you did not see with all of the law enforcement that rallied to that site of devastation and death was anyone raising their hand to say, let me stop for a moment. I'm engaged in collective bargaining. Or let me stop for a moment to see whether my contract gives me permission to run into a burning building. The remaining individuals from the Port of New York's police, firefighters, police of all levels beside NYPD, police officers that were off duty that came on duty, firefighters that were off duty that came on duty, firefighters from other stations that insisted on coming down to rescue their brothers who had been caught and tragically lost their life as they were bringing down, in essence, saving lives. Those are real stories of what first responders do. And with all due respect to the lady's good intentions, which I'm going to attribute, that there must be some basis for this, collective bargaining only gives basic quality of life and labor rights to workers and indicates to them that we respect the job you're doing, and the level of importance your work is. I think similar to the hearing that was held in this room yesterday, the questions that were raised by those brave law enforcement in the insurrection day of January 6th. Do you respect me enough to provide the resources that I need? Do you respect me enough to be able to get the answers to what happened? That is what we're doing here today in H.R. 903. And I'd ask the gentlelady to work with Congresswoman Titus to ensure that she is getting her intent, but to suggest that collective bargaining diminishes the level of service is certainly not accurate. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to put into the record, I'm not sure if it has been, the letter from the Transportation Trade Department of AFL-CIO that supports legislation H.R. 903. I ask unanimous consent. And with that, I yield back.
Excuse me. Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. And with that, I yield back to say that collective bargaining in no way threatens my security nor the security of the American people. I yield back.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad to have heard the term, do we respect them enough to give the resources we need? And I think in this committee, we should talk about all the law enforcement agencies and the agencies under the jurisdiction of this committee, and we should talk about the resources we need. And so I'd just like to associate myself with that particular sentence about a resource discussion, especially in the face of a budget that does not seem to be providing the resources that our law enforcement agency, that CBP in particular needs. So at some point in time, I hope we can take that up. I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Michigan.
Yeah, I just will say, you know, as a former CIA officer and Pentagon official, of course, I mean, this national security is what I've done, but this does seem like the amendment is a solution in search of a problem. If firefighters have collective bargaining, police officers have collective bargaining, Customs and Border Patrol have collective bargaining, can you cite examples where that has conflicted with national security? And the best corollary is that air traffic controllers have had collective bargaining since the 1980s. If you have specific instances where our air traffic controllers have preferenced their own needs over that of national security, name it. But otherwise, I believe this is unnecessary and just reinforces at a moment when these officers are trying to get the respect that they deserve, that we don't trust them. Cite the examples where they shouldn't be trusted, or I think this is an unnecessary amendment.
Thank you very much. Gentlelady yields back. There being no further debate, gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield the balance of my time to Ms. Kamak.
Thank you to my colleague, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I stress that this is about clarification of congressional intent. That is what this very simple, clear-cut amendment does. I have heard two very different arguments here today from my colleagues on the other side. It honestly is a bit baffling. We are simply clarifying our congressional intent, which I can't imagine that anyone in this room would think is a bad thing. And I also take issue with the fact that there has been a bit of a insult. As the wife of a first responder, my family knows very much what it means to serve in the face of tragedy, crisis, and my husband, for the last 14 years, has been running into buildings on fire that most people are running out of. So I take strong issue with some of the comments made here today. But again, I would like to reiterate that anyone who seeks to clarify the intent of this amendment, of really the role here, should be in support. This is simply a clarification of our congressional intent, and that we are prioritizing national security over collective bargaining. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. There being no further debate, the question on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Florida, Mrs. Kamak. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I will request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Jackson Lee? No. Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Langevin?
No.
Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Payne? Mr. Correa? No. Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Slotkin?
No.
Ms. Slotkin votes no. Mr. Cleaver?
No.
Mr. Cleaver
No.
votes no. Mr. Green?
Green votes nay. No.
Mr. Green votes no. Ms. Clark?
Ms. Clark votes no.
Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Swalwell? Ms. Titus?
Titus votes no.
Ms. Titus votes no. Mrs. Watson-Coleman?
No.
Mrs. Watson-Coleman votes no. Ms. Rice?
Rice votes no.
Ms. Rice votes no. Mrs. Demings? Mrs. Demings votes no. Ms. Barragan?
Barragan votes no.
Barragan votes no. Mr. Gottheimer?
No.
Mr. Gottheimer votes no. Mrs. Luria?
No.
Mrs. Luria votes no. Mr. Malinowski?
No.
Mr. Malinowski votes no. Mr. Torres?
No.
Mr. Torres votes no. Mr. Katko?
Yes.
Mr. Katko votes yes. Mr. McCall?
Aye.
Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Guest?
Aye.
Mr. Guest votes aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Van Drew?
Mr. Van Drew votes no.
Mr. Van Drew votes no. Mr. Norman? Yes. Mr. Norman votes yes. Mrs. Miller Meeks? Mrs. Harshbarger?
Harshbarger votes yes.
Mrs. Harshbarger votes yes. Mr. Clyde?
Yes.
Mr. Clyde votes yes. Mr. Jimenez?
Mr. Jimenez votes yes.
Mr. Jimenez votes yes. Mr. LaTurner?
Aye.
Mr. LaTurner votes aye. Mr. Meyer?
Mr. Meyer probably votes aye.
Mr. Meyer votes aye. Mrs. Kamick? Mrs. Kamick votes yes. Mr. Pfluger?
Aye.
Mr. Pfluger votes aye. Mr. Garbarino? Mr. Garbarino votes no. Mr. Payne? Mr. Swalwell?
Mr. Payne votes no. Mr. Payne votes no. Mr. Chair, this is Mr. Payne. I'm trying to record my vote, sir.
What is the problem with the clerk?
Mr. Payne's camera's not on.
Mr. Payne, turn your camera on.
Mr. Payne votes no.
Mr. Payne votes no. Here I am.
Yes, Mr. Payne votes no. Okay, Mr. Swalwell?
Hey, no.
Mr. Swalwell votes no.
No.
Mr. Higgins? Mr. Bishop? Mrs. Miller Meeks?
Is there any member wishing to vote or change their vote? How am I recorded?
The chairman is not recorded.
Chair votes no.
Chairman votes no. Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 11 yeas and 21 noes.
On this vote, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment on the roster offered by the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Guest. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 903, offered by Mr. Guest.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Guest, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will be brief. This amendment would sunset the requirements of H.R. 903 at the end of fiscal year 2022 if Congress does not appropriate sufficient funds to carry out the bill. With H.R. 9 having an estimated cost to taxpayers of nearly $2 billion, it is critical that the bill does not simply become an unfunded mandate. This amendment will remove the bill's requirement to move TSA to Title V if sufficient funding is not appropriated, which will protect other critical Homeland Security missions like cybersecurity and border security from being raided to enact this legislation. In TSA's feedback to H.R. 903, they explicitly said, implementation of the bill without additional adequate appropriations would have dire impacts upon the TSA mission and negatively impact national and economic security. Without funding, the impacts on our security are clear. With that, I urge all members to support this fiscally responsible amendment. And Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady, Ms. Rice, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is an attempt to completely undermine the intent of the bill. It would take away all the worker protections and benefits provided under this act if Congress does not fully appropriate funds for implementation by the end of fiscal year 2022. The first issue with this amendment is its timeline. In all likelihood, should we be successful in getting H.R. 903 enacted, the major outlays to fund employee pay increases would be with fiscal year 2023 funds. Put another way, given the bill's requirement that the workforce be transitioned to the general schedule pay system by the end of the calendar year 2022, providing funding in October 2022 should be sufficient. However, as we all know, Congress does not always finish the appropriations process on time, The idea that finalizing fiscal year 2023 appropriations a day or two late, and thus going past the end of fiscal year 2022 without providing sufficient funds for implementation, would strip workers of their collective bargaining rights, access to the Merit System Protection Board, and other protections. It's just preposterous. Furthermore, many of the bill's provisions do not require significant funding to carry out. Providing workers with full collective bargaining rights and third-party disciplinary appeals processes can occur without nearly the investment required to move the workforce to the general schedule pay system. One part of the bill should not be reliant on the successful on-time completion of another part. Put simply, the provision of basic rights for employees should not be contingent on funding. With the broad support this bill enjoys, I am confident we can secure the necessary funding to meet the timelines in the bill. But if we unfortunately are not successful in doing so as quickly as we hope, we don't just pick up our ball and go home. We keep fighting to fulfill the intent of the bills we enact, even if timelines sometimes need to be adjusted. Amending a bill to presuppose its failure is not a good faith effort to improve it. If my colleagues do not support the underlying bill, I'd suggest they just vote against the bill. I urge my colleagues to vote no, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. If there are no other speakers, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Guest. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed,
Aye.
no.
Aye.
No.
No.
In opinion of the chairs, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I would request recorded vote, please.
Recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Jackson Lee? No. Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Langevin?
No.
Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Payne? Mr. Correa? No. Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Slotkin?
No.
Ms. Slotkin votes no. Mr. Cleaver?
No.
Mr. Cleaver votes no. Mr. Green?
Green votes nay, no.
Mr. Green votes no. Ms. Clark?
Ms. Clark votes no.
Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Swalwell? Ms. Titus?
Titus votes no.
Ms. Titus votes no. Mrs. Watson-Coleman?
No.
Mrs. Watson-Coleman votes no. Ms. Rice?
Rice votes no.
Ms. Rice votes no. Mrs. Demings? Mrs. Demings votes no. Ms. Barragan?
Barragan votes no.
Ms. Barragan votes no. Mr. Gottheimer?
No.
Mr. Gottheimer votes no. Mrs. Luria?
No.
Mrs. Luria votes no. Mr. Malinowski?
No.
Mr. Malinowski votes no. Mr. Torres? Mr. Katko?
Yes.
Mr. Katko votes yes. Mr. McCall?
Aye.
Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Guest?
Aye.
Mr. Guest votes aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Van Drew?
Mr. Van Drew votes no.
Mr. Van Drew votes no. Mr. Norman? Mrs. Miller Meeks?
Miller Meeks, yes.
Mrs. Miller Meeks votes yes. Mrs. Harshbarger?
Harshbarger votes yes.
Mrs. Harshbarger votes yes. Mr. Clyde?
Yes.
Mr. Clyde votes yes. Mr. Jimenez?
Mr. Jimenez votes yes.
Mr. Jimenez votes yes. Mr. LaTurner?
Aye.
Mr. LaTurner votes aye. Mr. Meyer?
Aye.
Mr. Meyer votes aye. Mrs. Kamick? Mrs. Kamick votes aye. Mr. Pfluger?
Aye.
Mr. Pfluger votes aye. Mr. Garbarino? Mr. Garbarino votes no. Mr. Payne?
Mr. Payne votes no.
Mr. Payne votes no. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Torres?
No.
Mr. Torres votes no. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Bishop? Mr. Norman?
Is there any other member wishing to vote or wishing to change his or her vote? How am I recorded?
The chairman is not recorded.
Chair votes no.
Chairman votes no.
The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 11 yeas and 20 noes. Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 903 offered by Mr. Jimenez.
Mr. Chairman, did you recognize me?
Yes, gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I didn't hear that. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chairman Thompson. This amendment would ensure that no previously appropriated funds for the Department of Homeland Security would be used for the implementation of H.R. 903. As an example, we are currently facing an unprecedented crisis at our southern border. For the past several months, I and many of my colleagues have made it absolutely clear that our Border Patrol agents deserve all the funds that Congress has appropriated to succeed in their mission. Now we're seeing this border crisis turn into a public health crisis, the proliferation of COVID-19 variants making unscreened and unchecked migrants a threat to the public health of surrounding border communities and the United States. Given how overwhelmed Border Patrol agents are, it would be a disservice to divert whatever funds they currently have for any other projects within DHS. As such, Congress must ensure that all funds given to the Department of Homeland Security are used for their intended purposes and not diverted for managerial processes. This is why if H.R. 903 is enacted, we must appropriate the funds specifically to the TSA to implement this legislation. I call on my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any individuals speak in opposition?
Move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, not to repeat what I said before, but when you talk about, my colleague from Florida makes good points about other types of security. Yeah, when we talk about security at the airports, border security, cyber security, critical. But when it comes to having the possibility of a terrorist smuggling something into one of our planes intended to cause mass destruction in the air, send a signal to Americans, I'd say this is a huge priority, one of our number one priorities, if not our number one priorities, which is to professionalize our TSA workforce. And as I said before, when you look at those technicians behind those x-ray machines, when you look at the money we spend today on each and one of those x-ray machines, and know that they don't do the job, it's the person reading the data, sitting there hour after hour in front of that monitor, that's your frontline worker. We gotta prioritize those folks. We have to make sure that they're the best of the best, because only 100% defense is acceptable when it comes to airport security, when it comes to defending Americans in the air. And that's why I believe that this amendment appears to undercut your efforts, sir, to professionalize our TSA workforce through your rights of TSA Workforce Act of 2021. Furthermore, as members of Congress, we know that the appropriations process is separate and distinct from the authorizations process. And it is highly unusual to try to preempt, block off any funding initiatives before they're actually discussed in the appropriations process. Should this legislation be signed into law, and we will all work to make sure it is signed into law, we need to make sure that there's adequate funding for this initiative. It's surprising to see some of my colleagues today so troubled by the idea that federal monies would be shifted to give TSO officers better pay, to make TSO officers a professional workforce, when the last administration essentially shifted money from the military, including children's schools, to build an incredibly expensive and ineffective border wall. In fact, most of my colleagues here today, voted to allow these transfers to happen in last Congress, not once, but twice. And today, we're concerned about these shifts in funds. The past administration also took hundreds of millions of dollars in funding from across DHS to increase capacity to detain and remove immigrants without specific authorization or appropriations from Congress. And again, today, we are concerned about this specific issue. When it comes to helping our frontline TSA workforce, we need to make sure that we do not limit how DHS funding is appropriate, how we get the money to make sure we have nothing but the best TSA workers at our airports. And I can assure you today that no one has any intention of shifting funds from other programs or agencies for this initiative. But as legislators, we got to figure out how to get it done and how to get it done right. And we should all intend to work with the appropriators and our colleagues through Congress to make sure that this transition has the resources it needs. I think this amendment is not only unnecessary, but sends the wrong message. It sends the wrong message to the men and women of TSA workforce who go to work every day to keep us and our families safe. So, Chairman, I yield.
Gentleman yields. There being no further debate on the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Jimenez.
Chairman? Do I have time left? Do I have time left?
I can't understand the name.
Jimenez again? Mr. Jimenez, I'm asking to speak again.
Gentlemen, I'll recognize you this time, but you've already spoken. I'll recognize you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And nobody here is saying that our TSA workers are not professional. They are professional, and I trust them with the security of our nation. What I'm saying is that if the department does not get additional funds to implement this mandate, then they will take funds from other areas. And one of those could be our Customs and Border Protection agents or other security measures vital to the United States. And so what this means is, and this amendment, all it says is that no funds will be diverted from the Department of Homeland Security from other parts of the Department of Homeland Security to put this measure into effect, and that we, Congress, needs to appropriate the appropriate funds to implement this measure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yield.
Thank you for your consideration.
I agree with my colleague from Florida that we should all make sure that the funds are there to make sure that the TSA workers are in fact professionals. And so I would suggest the amendment be withdrawn and be rewritten in a way that says exactly that. We are going to make sure that the funds are there to implement this legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Gentlemen, there being no debate on, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Jimenez. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In opinion of the chairs, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask for a recorded vote, please.
A recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Jackson Lee? No. Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Langevin?
No.
Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Payne? Mr. Correa? No. Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Slotkin?
No.
Ms. Slotkin votes no. Mr. Cleaver?
No.
Mr. Cleaver votes no. Mr. Green?
Green votes nay. No.
Mr. Green votes no. Ms. Clark?
Ms. Clark votes no.
Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Swalwell? Ms. Titus?
Titus votes no.
Ms. Titus votes no. Mrs. Watson-Coleman?
No.
Mrs. Watson-Coleman votes no. Ms. Rice? Mrs. Demings? Mrs. Demings votes no. Ms. Barragan?
Barragan votes no.
Ms. Barragan votes no. Mr. Gottheimer?
Gottheimer votes no.
Mr. Gottheimer votes no. Mrs. Luria? Mr. Malinowski?
Mrs. Luria votes yes.
Mrs. Luria votes yes. Mr. Malinowski?
No.
Mr. Malinowski votes no. Mr. Torres?
No.
Mr. Torres votes no. Mr. Katko?
This is Mrs. Luria. I would like to change my vote when it's possible.
Mrs.
Luria votes no.
Mrs. Luria votes no. Mr. Katko?
Mr. Katko votes aye.
Mr. Katko votes aye. Mr. McCall?
McCall votes aye.
Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Guest?
Aye.
Mr. Guest votes aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Van Drew?
Yes.
Yes. Mr. Van Drew votes nay. Mr. Van Drew votes nay.
Mr. Van Drew votes nay. Mr. Norman? Mrs. Miller Meeks?
Miller Meeks, yes.
Mrs. Miller Meeks votes yes. Mrs. Harshbarger?
Harshbarger votes yes.
Mrs. Harshbarger votes yes. Mr. Clyde?
Mr. Clyde votes yes.
Mr. Clyde votes yes. Mr. Jimenez?
Mr. Jimenez votes yes.
Mr. Jimenez votes yes. Mr. LaTurner?
Aye.
Mr. LaTurner votes aye. Mr. Meyer?
Aye.
Mr. Meyer votes aye. Mrs. Kamick? Mrs. Kamick votes aye. Mr. Pfluger?
Aye.
Mr. Pfluger votes aye. Mr. Garbarino? Mr. Garbarino votes no. Mr. Payne?
Mr. Payne votes no.
Mr. Payne votes no. Mr. Swalwell? Ms. Rice? Mr. Higgins? Mr. Bishop? Mr. Norman?
How's the chair recorded?
Chair is not recorded.
Chair votes no.
Chairman votes no. Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 11 yeas, 19 noes.
The amendment is not adopted. There are no further amendments listed on the roster. Are there any further amendments to the mayorship? There being no further discussion and no further amendments listed on the roster, the question is on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 903 as amended. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no.
Aye.
In opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider. The question now occurs on reporting the bill H.R. 903 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no.
Aye.
No.
Aye.
No.
Aye.
No.
The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I'll request recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the vote.
Ms. Jackson Lee.
Aye.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Langevin.
Mr. Langevin votes aye.
Mr. Langevin votes aye. Mr. Payne.
Mr. Payne votes aye.
Mr. Payne votes aye. Mr. Correa. Aye. Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Slotkin.
Aye.
Ms. Slotkin votes aye. Mr. Cleaver.
Aye.
Mr. Cleaver votes aye. Mr. Green.
Green votes nay, no.
Mr. Green votes no. Ms. Clark.
Ms. Clark votes aye.
Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Swalwell. Ms. Titus.
Titus votes aye.
Ms. Titus votes aye. Mrs. Watson Coleman.
Yes, yes.
Mrs. Watson Coleman votes yes. Ms. Rice. Mrs. Demings. Mrs. Demings votes aye. Ms. Barragan.
Barragan votes aye.
Ms. Barragan votes aye. Mr. Gottheimer.
Gottheimer votes aye.
Mr. Gottheimer votes aye. Mrs. Luria.
Luria votes aye.
Mrs. Luria votes aye. Mr. Malinowski.
Aye.
Mr. Malinowski votes aye. Mr. Torres.
Vote aye.
Mr. Torres votes aye. Mr. Katko.
Mr. Katko regrettably votes no.
Mr. Katko votes no. Mr. McCall.
No.
Mr. McCall votes no. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Guest.
No.
Mr. Guest votes no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Van Drew.
Mr. Van Drew votes aye.
Mr. Van Drew votes aye. Mr. Norman. Mrs. Miller Meeks.
Miller Meeks, no.
Mrs. Miller Meeks votes no. Mrs. Harshbarger.
Harshbarger votes no.
Mrs. Harshbarger votes no. Mr. Clyde.
No.
Mr. Clyde votes no. Mr. Jimenez.
Mr. Jimenez votes no.
Mr. Jimenez votes no. Mr. LaTurner.
No.
Mr. LaTurner votes no. Mr. Meyer.
No.
Mr. Meyer votes no. Mrs. Kamick. Mrs. Kamick votes no. Mr. Pfluger.
No.
Mr. Pfluger votes no. Mr. Garbarino. Mr. Garbarino votes aye. Mr. Swalwell.
Mr. Chairman,
Ms. Rice. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Norman.
Is there any other member wishing to vote or wishing to change his or her vote?
Mr. Chairman Green of Texas, how am I recorded?
How's the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, recorded?
Mr. Green is recorded as a nay.
Mr. Chairman, I changed my vote to yay, yes.
Mr. Green is recorded as a yay.
Is there any other member wishing to vote or wishing to change his or her vote? Clerk, how am I recorded?
The chairman is not recorded.
Chair votes aye.
Chair votes, Mr. Chairman, it's recorded as an aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 19 yeas, 11 noes.
On the vote, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to consider is laid on the table. All the rest of our bills for the committee are agreed to en bloc. We can blow right through them and be done, or if members are wanting to speak on them, reluctantly, we'll have to come back. But in the interest of having been here for 2.5 hours, if I could ask that you submit it for the record, it'd be most appreciated. Given the bipartisan agreement on the remaining measures and amendments and out of consideration for members' time, the chair will make a unanimous consent request to call up the remaining measures and amendment. For this to happen expeditiously, as I already indicated, members will refrain from seeking recognition to speak on the remaining bills and amendments to the roster to allow the committee to complete consideration of the bills without interruption. After legislative business concludes, the chair will be pleased to recognize members or for you to submit for the record your statement. Without objection, during the consideration of H.R. 2915, H.R. 4089, H.R. 4094, H.R. 4209, H.R. 4363, H.R. 4426, H.R. 4611, H.R. 4682, and H.R. 4691. All bills will be considered read a first and second time, open to amendment at any point. All times for the debate will be considered expired, and further such time otherwise afforded for debate will be available to members following the committee's legislative business. Hearing no objections, so ordered. I now call up H.R. 2915. Just a minute. Clerk will read the bill.
H.R. 2915, to amend the Homeland Security Act of 2002 regarding the procurement of certain items related to national security interest for Department of Homeland Security frontline operational components and for other purposes.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Correa together with the amendments offered by Mr. Norman on the roster are agreed to. Are there any further amendments? Without any, if not, the question is on the bill, H.R. 2915 as amended. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nays.
Aye.
H.R. 40, hold on just a minute. I'm trying to get us through the if there's no disagreement, and there's unanimous agreement on all these bills we've negotiated. Without objection, we'll take up H.R. 4089, H.R. 4094, H.R. 4209, H.R. 4363, H.R. 4426, H.R. 4611, H.R. 4682, and H.R. 4691. I now ask for a motion to approve all those bills as identified.
So moved.
Second.
Well, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed,
Aye.
nay.
Aye.
So ordered.
Aye.
All the bills have been approved. Without objection, the amendments agreed to at today's markup will be reported to the House in the form of one amendment in the nature of a substitute for each bill. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to all measures to reflect the actions of the committee. Pursuant to today's order, members may now be recognized to speak on their legislation previously considered. I would encourage you to include it in the record of this committee. This concludes the consideration of the bill. Mr. Gottheimer.
I can speak at the end after everyone leaves, if that's helpful.
Beg pardon?
Is it helpful after I speak after you're done? I just want to speak
Okay.
for a minute. I don't
All right.
want to hold you up.
This concludes the consideration of the bills noticed by the committee today. Without objections, so ordered. There being no further business before the committee.
Yes, speak.
Just want to submit into the record, is that already included, Mr. Chairman?
Without objection, so ordered.
So,
And all our statements will be included?
well, you spoke plenty. Can I speak, if that's okay?
Yeah, just.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rules 11, Clause 2L, I ask that members have 2 calendar days to file with the clerk of the committee supplemental, additional, or minority views on each of the bills ordered reported by the committee today.
Without objection, so ordered. Gentlemen, Mr. Gottheimer is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson and Ranking Member Katko, for your leadership and the committee's excellent work on all these important measures. I especially want to thank my colleagues for passing H.R. 4089, the Darren Drake Act, bipartisan legislation I introduced with my Republican colleague, Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, to help protect Americans from terrorist vehicle attacks. This legislation is named in memory of my constituent Darren Drake of New Milford, New Jersey, who was one of 8 people who were tragically killed in the ISIS-inspired terrorist truck attacks in Lower Manhattan on October 31st, 2017. This bill will help prevent terrorist truck attacks by requiring the Department of Homeland Security to develop and disseminate best practices for vehicle rental companies and dealers to report suspicious behavior to law enforcement. These best practices will be developed and updated in consultation with state and local enforcement as well as industry stakeholders. Mr. Chairman, this critical step will provide rental companies and car dealers with the vital information they need to flag and stop potential threats in their tracks. As a result, Americans should expect all rental companies to report suspicious behavior at every point of sale. No excuses. In addition, the bill requires the Secretary of Homeland Security to report to Congress regarding the implementation of these best practices and other ways to help improve coordination between the department and rental vehicle providers. Mr. Chairman, this common-sense bipartisan bill is aimed at stopping ISIS-inspired and other domestic terrorists from easily acquiring trucks and other vehicles to wreak havoc and cause mass destruction and death. I want to thank Jimmy and Barbara Drake, my constituents, wonderful people, for working with me on this effort, and Jimmy for coming to me to first talk about this after he lost his son. And we will continue working to advance this measure in Darren's memory and honor to help prevent future attacks and save lives. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. As I get my voice back, I'd like to speak on H.R. 4209, the Illicit Border Tunnel Defense Act. Illicit cross-border tunnels and the illegal use of underground municipal infrastructure pose a persistent and serious threat to national security by providing a means for transnational criminal organizations to move drugs, weapons, currency, people, and other illegal contraband across the border. Since 1990, law enforcement personnel have discovered over 230 cross-border tunnels between the United States and Mexico. U.S. Customs and Border Protection Office of U.S. Border Patrol leads the United States government's response on illicit tunnel interdiction and remediation efforts. Tunnel remediation is a process where illicit cross-border tunnels are physically secured and then destroyed. This can be accomplished by filling tunnel cavities with concrete or other similar substances to prevent their use. Steel plates are then often used to fill the trenches where USBP digs to prevent new illicit cross-border tunnels from being created in the same area. In 2013, CBP established a Tunnel Program Management Office within USBP to lead tunnel detection technology efforts. The program has matured over the last few years and received funding to test and acquire technologies that can predict the locations and path of a tunnel and confirm the tunnel's existence through mapping and measurements. Due to USBP's enhanced ability to detect tunnels along the border, there is now a need to scale tunnel interdiction and remediation operations to close this security gap. USBP has a growing list of known tunnels to interdict and remediate, but they do not have the appropriate specialized team, resources, and funding to do so. To inform the growth of a counter-tunnel operations team, there is also a need for a plan to approach tunnel threats in a strategic manner. This bill addresses both of those needs. My bill requires CBP to, 1, develop a strategic plan which would address risk-based criteria and best practices for interdicting and remediating illicit cross-border tunnels. 2, develop a process for sharing information in coordination with federal partners, key indicators of a tunnel construction for educational purpose. And 3, finally, develop an assessment of technology and personnel needs. This legislation is timely, as the longest cross-border tunnel ever discovered along the U.S.-Mexico border was found in January 2020. The tunnel had a rail and cart system, forced air ventilation, high-voltage electrical system with cables, and an elevator at the entrance, demonstrating the lengths that criminal organizations are willing to go to smuggle drugs across the southwest border. And who could forget that the leader of the Sinaloa drug cartel, Joaquin Guzman Loera, otherwise known as El Chapo, in his famous escape from a Mexican super maximum security prison from one of the most sophisticated super tunnels ever found. I'd also like to take just a moment to discuss how important this legislation is, not only to our efforts here in the United States, but also to helping our allies such as Israel and South Korea to find, identify, and prevent tunnels that come into those countries from North Korea and from Lebanon and the Gaza Strip. This is an important effort as we look at human trafficking, the prevention of drugs, and prevent efforts for future terrorist or terrorism activities. As the ranking member of the Intelligence and Counterterrorism Subcommittee, I'm proud to lead this effort to help secure our country, as was said previously, that nothing outweighs our national security efforts. I'd like to thank Chairman Thompson and Ranking Member Katko for your support and for prioritizing this bill. With the surge of illicit border activity, both above ground and underground, it is more important now than ever to develop a strategic plan and to increase CBP resources to remediate illicit cross-border tunnels to secure our homeland and protect our national security. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the young lady from Texas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Two amendments on two different bills I want to very briefly speak of. Let me congratulate the gentleman from New York on the DHS Software Supply Chain Risk Management Act. But we're finding that software that's being built often reuses code components that are kept in libraries to support rapid development of application and software tools. The issue of secure software begins with the underlying code, but this may be complicated by time pressures to work quickly, so much so that the ease of using existing code to build routine components of software applications become commonplace. Mr. Chairman, there lies our vulnerability. There lies the complete open door for hacking, and we know that it has become an epidemic. Because this is a method used to produce most of today's software application, large projects may include thousands of third-party code components that, as I said, is an open door that may be sourced from public repositories of existing code to build new applications, and again, open door to this kind of potential abuse. These are reused codes. they may be known far and wide, and it generates major vulnerability management problems due to the complex system. The Jackson Lee Amendment adds to the section on certification notification a requirement that a notification of each security vulnerability or defect that affects the security of the product or service requires notice to DHS. We have found that has been a major problem in the government not knowing the vulnerabilities in the private sector. The present bill has remedial steps, including reporting on the plan to mitigate, repair, or resolve each security vulnerability or defect listed in the notification. The Jackson Lee Amendment, adding the requirement of reporting on defects that affect the security of the product or service, strengthens the tools available to DHS to know what they are acquiring when they spend taxpayer dollars. In addition, this amendment adds to the Bill of Materials section, which directs that the list of parts and components of products or services be part of the information provided to DHS by requiring that the vendor must disclose whether the component is new or used code. Finally, in the amendment or bill that has been offered by Mr. Gottenheimer, I also congratulate Mr. Torres for his bill. I congratulate Mr. Gottenheimer for his bill. But I have very brief comments. The Jackson Lee Amendment directs the Secretary of DHS, when developing best practices for enacting the bill, that the process provides guidance on defining and identifying suspicious behavior in a manner that protects civil rights and civil liberties. There is an Office of Civil Liberties and Civil Rights in the DHS, and this amendment will provide for that kind of guidance and also protection of the American public. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to briefly talk about our legislation, H.R. 2915. Very simple but important legislation. The Homeland Procurement Reform Act, or HOPPER, seeks to reform the way DHS buys uniforms and protective gears. Simply put, this is a result of hard work, partisan, bicameral effort to equip our DHS, that is, to equip our frontline personnel workers with high-quality, American-made uniforms and equipment. This bill requires, to the maximum extent possible, that at least 1/3 of the funds obligated for procurement of uniforms and other items covered under this act be used to purchase goods that are made by American small businesses. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for working with me on this most important legislation. And with that, I yield.
Gentlemen, yields. There being no further business before the committee, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.